Committee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. This is the seventh in a series of public hearings the committee will be holding as part of the House of Representatives Impeachment Inquiry. With that, I now recognize myself to give an opening statement in the impeachment inquiry into Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. Yesterday morning, the committee heard from Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the American ambassador to the European Union, the de facto leader of the Three Amigos, who had regular access to President Donald Trump and pressed the new Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, for two investigations Trump believed would help his re-election campaign. The first investigation was of a discredited conspiracy theory that Ukraine and not Russia was responsible for interfering in our 2016 election. The second investigation was into the political rival Trump apparently feared most, Joe Biden. Trump sought to weaken Biden and to refute the fact that his own election had been helped by a Russian hacking and dumping operation and Russian social media campaign directed by Vladimir Putin. Trump's scheme stood in contrast to the long-standing bipartisan foreign policy of the United States by undermining military and diplomatic support for a key ally and set back U.S. anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. In conditioning a meeting with Zelensky and then military aid on securing an investigation of his rival, Trump put his personal and political interests above the United States. As Ambassador Sondland would later tell career Foreign Service Officer David Holmes immediately after speaking to the President, Trump did not give an expletive about Ukraine. He cares about big stuff that benefits him, like the Biden investigation that Giuliani was pushing. David Holmes is here with us today. He is a Foreign Service officer currently serving as the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Also with us is Dr. Fiona Hill, whose job as the National Security Council's Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs encompassed the coordination of U.S. policy towards Ukraine. If the President abused his power and invited foreign interference in our elections, if he sought to condition, coerce, extort, or bribe a vulnerable ally into conducting investigations to aid his re-election campaign and did so by withholding official acts, a White House meeting, or hundreds of millions of dollars of needed military aid, it will be for us to decide whether those acts are compatible with the office of the presidency. I now recognize Ranking Member Nunes for any remarks he would like to make.
Thank you. Throughout these bizarre hearings, the Democrats have struggled to make the case that President Trump committed some impeachable offense on his phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. The offense itself changes depending on the day, ranging from quid pro quo to extortion to bribery to obstruction of justice, then back to quid pro quo. It's clear why the Democrats have been forced onto this carousel of accusations. President Trump had good reason to be wary of Ukrainian election meddling against his campaign and of widespread corruption in that country. President Zelensky, who didn't even know aid to Ukraine had been paused at the time of the call, has repeatedly said there was nothing wrong with the conversation. The aid was resumed without the Ukrainians taking the actions they were supposedly being coerced into doing. Aid to Ukraine under President Trump has been much more robust than it was under President Obama, thanks to the provision of Javelin anti-tank weapons. As numerous witnesses have testified, temporary holds on foreign aid occur fairly frequently for many different reasons. So how do we have an impeachable offense here when there's no actual misdeed and no one even claiming to be a victim? The Democrats have tried to solve this dilemma with a simple slogan: he got caught. President Trump, we are to believe, was just about to do something wrong, and getting caught was the only reason he backed down from whatever nefarious thought crime the Democrats are accusing him of almost committing. I once again urge Americans to continue to consider the credibility of the Democrats on this committee who are now hurling these charges. For the last 3 years, it's not President Trump who got caught. It's the Democrats who got caught. They got caught falsely claiming they had more than circumstantial evidence that Trump colluded with Russians to hack the 2016 election. They got caught orchestrating this entire farce with the whistleblower and lying about their secret meetings with him. They got caught defending the false allegations of the Steele dossier, which was paid for by them. They got caught breaking their promise that impeachment would only go forward with bipartisan support because of how damaging it is to the American people. They got caught running a sham impeachment process featuring secret depositions, hidden transcripts, and an unending flood of Democrat leaks to the media. They got caught trying to obtain nude photos of President Trump from Russian pranksters.
Okay, and what's the nature of the compromise?
Well, there were pictures of naked Trump.
Okay. And so Putin was made aware of the availability of the compromising material?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We will be back in touch.
Pretending to be Ukrainians. And they got caught covering up for Alexander Chalupa, a Democratic National Committee operative who colluded with Ukrainian officials to smear the Trump campaign by improperly redacting her name from deposition transcripts and refusing to let Americans hear her testimony as a witness in these proceedings. That is the Democrats' pitiful legacy in recent years. They got caught. Meanwhile, their supposed star witness testified that he was guessing that President Trump was tying Ukrainian aid to investigations despite no one telling him that was true. And the president himself explicitly telling him the opposite, that he wanted nothing from Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, unless the Democrats once again scramble their kangaroo court rules, today's hearing marks the merciful end of this spectacle in the Impeachment Committee, formerly known as the Intelligence Committee. Whether the Democrats reap the political benefit they want from this impeachment remains to be seen, but the damage they have done to this country will be long-lasting. With this wrenching attempt to overthrow the president, they have pitted Americans against one another and poisoned the mind of fanatics who actually believe the entire galaxy of bizarre accusations they have leveled against the president since the day the American people elected him. I sincerely hope the Democrats end this affair as quickly as possible so our nation can begin to heal the many wounds it has inflicted on us. The people's faith in government and their belief that their vote counts for something has been shaken. From the Russia hoax to this shoddy Ukrainian sequel, the Democrats got caught. Let's hope they finally learn a lesson, give their conspiracy theories a rest, and focus on governing for a change. In addition, Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2J1, the Republican members transmit our request to convene a minority day of hearings. To date, you have blocked key witnesses that we have requested from testifying in this partisan impeachment inquiry. This rule was not displaced by H.Res. 660, and therefore, under House Rule 11, Clause 1A, it applies to the Democrats' impeachment inquiry. We look forward to the chair promptly scheduling an agreed-upon time for the minority day of hearings so that we can hear from key witnesses that you have continually blocked from testifying. I'd also like to take a quick moment on an assertion Ms. Hill made in the statement that she submitted to this committee, in which she claimed that some committee members deny that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. As I noted in my opening statement, on Wednesday that in March 2018, Intelligence Committee Republicans published the results of a year-long investigation into Russian meddling. The 240-page report analyzed 2016 Russian meddling campaign, the U.S. government reaction to it, Russian campaigns in other countries, and provided specific recommendations to improve American election security. I'm going to ask my staff to hand these reports to our two witnesses today, just so they can have a recollection of their memory. As America may or may not know, Democrats refused to sign on to the Republican report. Instead, they decided to adopt minority views filled with collusion conspiracy theories. Needless to say, it is entirely possible for two separate nations to engage in election meddling at the same time, and Republicans believe we should take meddling seriously by all foreign countries, regardless of which campaign is the target. I'd like to submit for the record a copy of our report titled Report on Russian Active Measures. I yield back.
Today we are joined by Dr. Fiona Hill and David Holmes. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you may be seated. First of all, thank you both for being here. Thank you for testifying. Dr. Hill, your story reminds me a great deal of what we heard from Alexander Vindman. The few immigrant stories that we have heard just in the course of these hearings are among the most powerful, I think, I've ever heard. You and and Colonel Vindman and others are the best of this country, and you came here by choice, and we are so blessed that you did. So welcome. My colleagues took some umbrage with your opening statement, but I think the American people can be forgiven if they have the same impression listening to some of the statements of my colleagues during this hearing that Russia didn't intervene in our election, it was all the Ukrainians. There's been an effort to take a tweet here and an op-ed there and a newspaper story here and somehow equate it with the systemic intervention that our intelligence agencies found that Russia perpetrated in 2016 through an extensive social media campaign and a hacking and dumping operation. Indeed, the report my colleagues gave you that they produced during the investigation calls into question the accuracy of the intelligence committee's finding that Russia intervened to help one side, to help Donald Trump at the expense of Hillary Clinton. No one in the intelligence community questions that finding, nor does the FBI, nor does the Senate Bipartisan Intelligence Committee report, nor does the Minority Committee report of this committee. The House Republican report is an outlier.
Don't believe the crap you see from these people, the fake news. I mean, I saw a piece on NBC today. NBC, not just CNN. CNN's the worst. They were interviewing people. They probably go through 20, and then they pick the one that sounds like the worst.
This will be appropriate time to break, and we'll resume with the minority 45 minutes. If people, before they leave, could allow the witnesses to leave first, and if committee members could come back promptly after votes. Meeting will come to order. Chair now recognizes the ranking member or their counsel for the first round of their 45-minute questions.
Thank the gentleman. I want to get a few basic facts on the table of individuals that were involved in the 2016 election, just to see who you know and who you've met with. So I'll start with you, Mr. Holmes. Have you met with or do you know Alexandra Chalupa?
Holmes, could you put your microphone on?
No.
Do you know Nellie Orr? Have you met with Nellie Orr? Bruce Orr?
No.
Glenn Simpson?
No.
Thank you. Same question for you, Dr. Hill. Do you know or have you met with Alexander Chalupa?
No.
Nellie Orr?
No.
Bruce Orr?
Only in the course of my previous position as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia, where he attended some of the meetings that I presided over.
Years ago?
That's a long time ago, correct?
Glenn Simpson?
No.
Dr. Hill, in your testimony, you said that, in your deposition, excuse me, that Christopher Steele was your counterpart at one time. Is this correct?
That's correct, yes.
You testified that you met with Christopher Steele in 2016. I assume that's still correct?
That's correct, yes.
And the only thing we didn't get on that is, do you know about when that was in 2016 and how many times?
I'm afraid I don't. I actually had met with him, well, you asked me actually in the deposition when the most recent time that I had met with him, in 2016. Mm-hmm. And he retired from the British Intelligence Services in 2009, which is the same time.
I'm asking about 2016.
2016, I don't recall, but I did meet with him sometimes before 2016.
But you don't remember the date?
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
Okay. You stated in your deposition that a colleague had showed you the Steele dossier before it was published. Who was that colleague?
That was one of my colleagues at the Brookings Institution.
And who was that?
That was the Brookings Institution President Strobe Talbot, who had been sent a copy of this.
And he shared it with you?
That was the day before it was published in BuzzFeed.
Thank you. You mentioned in your deposition also that you thought that it was a, let's get the exact quote, that the dossier was a rabbit hole. Is that still your testimony?
That's correct.
Do you know who paid Christopher Steele to generate the Steele dossiers? There were several of them.
At the time, I did not know. I understand from the media that it was through GPS Fusion. If that's not correct,
you know who was, and there was a law firm involved, but you know who the source of the money was?
I didn't at the time, no, I did not.
But do you know who
Well, now I've read it in reports, and thanks to your colleagues as well, that it was the DNC, as I'm led to believe.
And the Clinton campaign?
I don't know that for sure.
Okay. Mr. Castor.
Good afternoon, welcome back from lunch. Hope you had some sandwiches or something delicious.
Hope you did too.
Were you encouraged as of your last day in the office that U.S. policy towards the Ukraine was headed in the right direction?
I was not.
And why was that?
Well, I was concerned about two things in particular. One was, again, the removal of our ambassador. And again, I will say for the record that the President has a perfect right to remove any ambassador at any time for any reason. But I was very concerned about the circumstances in which her reputation had been maligned repeatedly on television and in all kinds of exchanges. I felt that that was completely unnecessary. If the President wanted to remove an ambassador, which he did quite frequently, there was a number of ambassadors removed who were not political but career officials. That was done, but without these kinds of interventions. I wondered what that message was being sent. So there was that. And then on the second front, it was very clear at this point that there was, let's just say, a different channel in operation in relations to Ukraine, one that was domestic and political in nature, and that was very different from the channel or the loop, however you like it, that I and my colleagues were in, where we were focused on bilateral relations and US foreign policy toward Ukraine. And these two things had diverged at this point.
In the run-up to Ambassador Yovanovitch's separation from post, did you have any communications with officials at the State Department about your concerns?
I did.
Okay. And you advocated to all those officials about your concerns about the information being spread about Ambassador Yovanovitch?
I did, that's correct.
The Trump administration changed courses from its predecessor and provided lethal defensive assistance to the Ukraine. Were you in favor of arming the Ukrainians with the javelins?
I was not initially in 2015 before I joined the government. However, when I came into government in 2017 and started to interact with all of my colleagues in the Pentagon, and you had Laura Cooper here yesterday, I realized, in fact, that there'd been an awful lot of work done on this, and that there was a clear and consistent plan for the sustainability long-term of the Ukrainian military. So I changed my mind.
Okay. And you're in fact, one of the, I believe, the only witness that we've spoken to that has been able to articulate the opposition to providing the javelins. And as we understand it, during the Obama administration, the interagency consensus was, in fact, to provide the javelins, but they were not provided. Were you aware of the decision back then?
I was, and I think it was very much made on a political basis about concerns that this would provoke the Russians, depending on how this was presented. And we were very mindful of that also when there were the discussions internally about the lethal defensive weapons inside of the administration.
Mr. Holmes, you're on the ground in Kyiv, and the javelins have now been authorized, provided. What's the view from the field, the U.S. Embassy, as to the effectiveness of the javelins?
They're an important strategic deterrent. They're not actively employed in combat operations right now, but the mere idea that were the Russians to advance substantially using certain kinds of armor, that the Ukrainians would have this capability, deters them from doing so. It also thereby sends a very important symbolic message to the Ukrainian military that they have access to this high-end technology and that we trust them to do it. I would only add also they've offered to buy some using their own funds. The initial tranche was provided through basically a program to do that, but they've now offered to spend their own money to buy more. So I think they think they're important.
And Ambassador Taylor has testified, Mr. Kent has testified that this is, in fact, the consensus of the interagency providing the javelins. Is it the, in your experience working with Ambassador Taylor, was he also very much an advocate for this?
Yes.
Mr. Holmes, I want to go back to name some Americans. Now I want to talk a little bit about Ukrainian government officials. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with Sergei Leshchenko?
Yes.
Have you met with him?
I have.
He was a journalist, then he was in the parliament. Is he currently in the parliament?
Journalist again.
Journalist again. Are you aware that when he was in the parliament that he had provided information to a Fusion GPS operative named Nellie Orr?
I'm not aware of Nellie Orr. I'm not aware of who he provided information to. I'm aware that as a journalist, he's provided information.
Well, he was in the parliament at the time. This is in the 2016 campaign. He provided widely known as the Black Ledger. Have you ever heard of the Black Ledger?
I have.
And the Black Ledger, is that seen as credible information?
Yes.
The Black Ledger is credible?
Yes.
Bob Mueller did not find it credible. Do you dispute what Bob Mueller's findings were? They didn't use it in the prosecution or in the report?
I'm not aware that Bob Mueller did not find it credible. I think it was evidence in other criminal proceedings, and its credibility was not questioned in those proceedings, but I'm not an expert on that matter.
So the motivation for Leshchenko, as was reported to, was to go after a Trump campaign official and undermine Trump's candidacy. Are you aware of that?
If you mean by the release of the Black Ledger, I think Leshchenko's motivation was the same motivation he's always expressed, which is to expose corruption in Ukraine.
Right, but he's admitted motivation was to partly at least undermine the Trump candidacy that he did not support.
He has not said that to me. If he said that to you, I'll take your word for it.
And you're aware that you heard Dr. Hill's testimony, but the Steele dossier that contained that initial information that was fed in the FBI, were you aware that the Democrats had paid for that information?
So, sir, I never had any involvement directly with it.
I'm not accusing you of involvement. I'm just asking if you, not even if you knew at the time, but you now know today that the Democrats had paid for that information.
So I do want to be clear that all that happened before I arrived in Ukraine, so I don't have any firsthand...
Not accusing any involvement of you with the Steele dossier.
Understood, but I do want to be clear about that. And then in addition, I have read about those issues, but I'm not an expert on them.
But you're not disputing that the Democrats and the Clinton campaign were the source of funds that funded the Steele dossier?
I wouldn't be in a position to dispute that, sir.
Do you think it's appropriate for political parties to run operatives in foreign countries to dig up dirt on their opponents?
No.
Dr. Hill, do you think it's appropriate for political parties to pay operatives to dig up dirt on their opponents?
I do not.
Secretary Perry had become interested in some of the energy-related issues in the Ukraine.
I actually recommended that Secretary Perry be the lead, along with others.
And what can you tell us about his involvement in some of the Ukrainian policy?
Well, Secretary Perry's engagement in this made, again, perfect sense, given his role as Secretary of Energy, also his deep knowledge of the energy industry, his former governorship. Secretary Perry himself is an extraordinarily good advocate of U.S. interests, particularly in the energy sphere. And one of Ukraine's Achilles' heel, in addition to its military disadvantage with Russia, is in fact energy. Ukraine remains for now the main transit point for Russian oil and gas and pipelines to Europe. And this has been manipulated repeatedly, especially since 2006, by the Russian government. And in fact, I mean, many of you here will remember in the Reagan era, there was a huge dispute between the United States and Europe about whether it made sense for Europe to build pipelines from the then Soviet Union to bring gas to European markets.
Since we're on the topic of Ukraine energy, I think it's a good way for us to segue into Burisma, which I assume both of you are familiar with. You've heard about it for many, many years. You're on the ground there now, Mr. Holmes. I know you weren't there, but at the time, but in September 2015, then Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, Obama-appointed career ambassador. I'm sure you know him.
I do.
Credible?
Yes.
Successful ambassador, I'm sure. He called for an investigation into Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, President of Burisma. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. Did you know about Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Pence concerns about the potential conflict of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
I would defer to George Kent, who was involved at the time and is an expert on those issues.
As you know, that the financial records show that this Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to the American accounts of Hunter Biden?
I've heard that.
Were you familiar with that, Dr. Hill?
Only from newspaper reports.
If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. You got fired.
Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after the vice president forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
No.
Joe Biden hit back at allegations over his son Hunter, saying there was nothing corrupt about the firing of that Ukrainian prosecutor. But that is a total dodge. The real scandal is not about the firing of the damn prosecutor. It's about U.S. cash for Ukraine gas. It involves not just the Bidens, but former Secretary of State John Kerry and a growing number of Democratic senators, as our special investigation will reveal tonight.
Did you know that Burisma's American lawyers tried to secure a meeting with the new state prosecutor the same day the predecessor, Victor Shokin's firing was announced?
No.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016, shortly after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
No.
Did you know that Devin Archer and Hunter Biden reached out to the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, shortly after the raid on Burisma?
No.
So, Dr. Hill, did you know about, I don't want to go through and ask all those questions over again.
I also did not know. That's
You did
correct.
not know about any of those?
I did not know, no.
Okay. So, you obviously know that the president had concerns about Burisma. had concerns about 2016 election meddling by the Ukrainians. When you were in there as the head of the Ukraine desk, did you ever raise any of these? Did you ever brief the president or raise it up to Ambassador Bolton about any concerns through 2017 and 18 that concerned 2016 election meddling or Burisma concerns?
The whole briefing process didn't really work in the way that you're suggesting there. So if the president had asked about any of this information, it would have been provided. So there weren't that frequent briefings on Ukraine. The briefings would take place when there was a scheduled meeting with a Ukrainian head of state. Mm-hmm. And as we know, there haven't been too many of those.
So but as far as you know, you did no briefings, no papers, answered no questions as it relates to the 2016 election or Burisma during your time there?
No, I did not know.
Mr. Castro.
And Dr. Hill, you told us during your deposition that indeed that there are perceived conflict of interest troubles when the child of a government official is involved with something that government official has an official policy role in, correct?
I think any family member of any member of the U.S. government, Congress, or the Senate is open to all kinds of questions about optics and of perhaps undue outside influence if they take part in any kind of activity that could be misconstrued as being related to their parent or other family member's work. So as a matter of course, yes, I do think that's the case.
Yes, sir, sorry. Dr. Hill, I just want to drill down on this a little bit. The President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief, was concerned about the 2016 elections and Burisma. He had his personal attorney working these issues because he was under investigation by Robert Mueller, special counsel, partly beginning with an investigation that started with the Steele dossier that we've already established that the Democrats had paid for and had then fed into the FBI. So at the end of the day, the Commander-in-Chief concerned about 2016 election meddling by Ukraine. Sounds like you had just earlier testified that you weren't aware of that. But if that was the concern of the president, to try to get to the bottom of it, and it's the concern of Ambassador Sondland, who was trying to set up meetings on behalf of, to ensure really that meetings occurred and phone calls occurred to strengthen the relationship. I understand the people at the NSC, people at the State Department had issues with that, but at the end of the day, isn't it the Commander-in-Chief that makes those decisions?
My point, Mr. Nunes, is that we at the National Security Council were not told, either by the President directly or through Ambassador Bolton, that we were to be focused on these issues as a matter of U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine.
Mr. Morrison told us both in his deposition and his public hearing that you had related concerns about Colonel Vindman's judgment.
I did not relate any concerns in general terms about Colonel Vindman's judgment, so I was somewhat surprised when I heard Mr. Morrison make that assertion and when I read his deposition. There was a very specific point that was made, and again, these are personnel issues, and I'm sure that nobody here would like to have their private personnel issues put before a committee, but you've asked me about this. So Colonel Vindman is a highly distinguished, decorated military officer. He came over to us from the chairman's office and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we were evaluating and looking at him in the context of what his future positions would be in the context of the US Army. And I was concerned that if, for example, Colonel Vindman might decide to leave the military, that perhaps he wasn't as well suited for something that would be much more political. I did not feel that he had the political antenna to deal with something that was straying into domestic politics. Not everyone is suited for that. That does not mean in any way that I was questioning his overall judgment, nor was I questioning in any way his substantive expertise. He is excellent on issues related to Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, on Russian defense issues. He had been in charge of the Russia campaign, thinking through at the chairman's office and in the Pentagon. This was a very specific issue, and we were concerned about how he would manage what was becoming a highly charged and potentially partisan issue, which had not been before.
And Colonel Vindman related to us during his deposition that he subsequently was sort of cut out of a lot of the decision-making and involvements with the embassy in Ukraine. Was that something you recommended?
Not with the embassy in Ukraine. I mean, we did pull him back from the meeting in May in the Oval Office. And subsequently, we were very concerned about these political aspects to this. And we did not feel, when July 10th, Colonel Vindman was justifiably alarmed when he realized that there was this highly political aspect of the meeting that we were looking for eventually with President Zelensky.
That concludes the 45-minute rounds. We'll now go to member questioning. Dr. Hill, I want to ask you, you may be aware of some of the attacks on Colonel Vindman, suggesting that he has a dual loyalty, that he's not really loyal to America, he's loyal to Ukraine. I wanted to ask you, as a fellow immigrant, what you think of those kind of accusations when they're leveled against Colonel Vindman or other Americans.
I think it's very unfortunate. I mean, this is a country of immigrants, with the exception, perhaps of very few people still here. Everyone immigrated to the United States at some point in their family history. And this is what, for me, really does make America great. I mean, I'm sure that every single person here, some people perhaps came reluctantly, others came by choice, as I did. But this is, for me, this is the essence of America. It's why I wanted to be here and why I wanted to stay here. And I think it's unfair to castigate anyone. Everyone has some kind of appellate to them. I'm an Anglo-American, perhaps, then, or I'm a British American, I'm a naturalized citizen. I do not believe that my loyalty is to the United Kingdom. My loyalty is here to the United States. This is my country and the country that I serve. And I know for a fact that every single one of my colleagues, and there were many naturalized citizens in my office and across the National Security Council, felt exactly the same way. I think it's deeply unfair.
I want to ask you about one of those deals, the one that Ambassador Bolton described as a drug deal. Thank you. Mr. Nunes.
I assume we're getting 8 minutes there?
Mr. Nunes, I don't cut off a witness in the middle of their answer. You may proceed.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Holmes, why didn't your boss talk about it?
What's that, sir?
Why didn't your boss bring up the call that you overheard? The reason you're here today. I mean, you're their closing witness, yet their star witness, their first witness, Ambassador Taylor, didn't even bring it up. And when we deposed you, you said this was extremely distinctive experience, one of the most remarkable events of my life. You described it like this. You said, after the call happens, I immediately told Deputy Chief of Mission and others at the embassy about the call. Then you said you went on vacation. You told several friends and family about the call. Then you come back on August 6th and you tell Ambassador Taylor about the call. And then in your deposition statement, you said in your statement today as well, I repeatedly referred to the call in meetings and conversations where the issue of the president's interest in Ukraine was relevant. I repeatedly referred to the call in meetings and conversations where the issue of the president's interest in Ukraine was relevant. That sounds like government speak for you told everybody. Yet their star witness, their first witness, Ambassador Taylor, when he came here, he related 13 different conversations he had between July 18th when the aid is frozen, September 11th when it's released. 13 different conversations, never once mentioning this call. July 19th, Dr. Hill and Colonel Vindman told Taylor what Sondland told them. July 19th, Sondland told Taylor about the upcoming Trump-Zelensky call. July 20th, Sondland told Taylor what Sondland told Zelensky to tell Trump. July 20th, Dana Look tells Taylor what Zelensky told Dana Look. July 28th, Morrison tells Taylor what happened on the Trump-Zelensky call. August 16th, Volker tells Taylor what Yarmak told Volker. August 21st, Breckbull talks to Taylor. August 22nd, Morrison talks to Taylor. August 29th, Yarmak talks to Taylor. September 1st, Morrison tells Taylor what Sondland told Morrison about what Yarmak told Sondland. September 2nd, Morrison tells Taylor what Daniluk told Morrison. September 7th, Morrison tells Taylor what Sondland told Trump. And September 8th, Sondland tells Taylor what Trump told Sondland. Nowhere is there a Holmes tells Taylor what the President of the United States told From
May I answer that
13
question?
conversations. Yeah, I'll get to you. I'll give you a chance here in a second. But 13 conversations from their star witness. You're their closing witness, and he can't remember a call from a guy he works with every single day. Why?
Yes, sir. So immediately when I went back to the embassy after this lunch on the 26th, I told my direct supervisor, the deputy chief of mission, I would have told Ambassador Taylor immediately, except he was on the front lines that afternoon. I then went on, as I testified, my vacation on Saturday, came back the following Monday, and on Tuesday, I was back in the ambassador's office where I referred to the call. In that week plus that I was away, it was my assumption that the deputy chief of mission would have informed other people about the call as well. So my recollection is when I did refer to the call in that meeting that Ambassador Taylor nodded knowingly as though he had been briefed on it. So I referred to the call and I mentioned some of my takeaways from the call. And at the time, the main takeaway from the call was the president doesn't care about Ukraine. So we're going to have a tough road ahead to convince him that it's important enough for him to schedule an Oval Office meeting for President Zelensky and ultimately to release this hold on security assistance. That was the takeaway. And that's what I referred to repeatedly in the coming weeks whenever it became relevant. And I'll remind you, sir, that one more important point. Throughout this time, as I've testified, we were trying to find a formula, things we could do with the Ukrainians that would convince the president that they were worth talking to.
Maybe, Mr. Holmes, the takeaway was he thought it was no big deal because he already knew. He didn't remember it because we already had the transcript.
No,
he didn't remember the we had the Trump-Zelensky transcript had been out for 2 months.
Sir, I believe that
even though you're repeatedly bringing this conversation up, as you said, to everybody anytime there's a talk about Ukraine, you recall this conversation. Maybe it was the transcript. The call happened on the July 25th. That's 4 months ago. The transcript's been out for 2 months. Maybe the ambassador thought this is nothing new here. But shazam, last week you come forward with supposedly this new information. There is nothing different in there than what we had on the transcript. Maybe that's the reason their star witness, their first witness, didn't bring it up. But they had to have something. So you're their closing witness because you overheard the president talking to Ambassador Sondland.
Sir, if I could answer, I see 4 seconds left on the clock. I believe that
Mr. Holmes, you may take as long as you need.
Thank you, sir. I believe that Ambassador Taylor did already know when I briefed him when I returned from vacation on the 6th. It was not news to him that the president was pressing for a Biden investigation.
That's not what I asked. I asked why he didn't share with us.
Mr. Jordan, please do not interrupt the witness any further. Mr. Holmes,
this is exactly
Mr. Jordan's time has expired, but yours has not.
Okay, thank you, sir.
You may answer the question.
It's exactly my point. I briefed the call in detail to the deputy chief of mission, went away for a week, come back, I refer to the call, and everyone is nodding. Of course that's what's going on. Of course the president is pressing for a Biden investigation before he'll do these things the Ukrainians want. There was nodding agreement. So did I go through every single word in the call? No, because everyone by that point agreed. It was obvious what the president was pressing for. And Ambassador Taylor, as you've just outlined, had all those other interactions with all these other people.
But he didn't share it with us.
Mr. Jordan, please do not interrupt.
But sir, sir, my vivid recollection of an event I was involved with was a touchstone experience that to me validated what we believed. And Ambassador Taylor was not in that call.
And so all of a sudden last week you got to come tell us, right?
Mr. Jordan, your boss will allow the witness to answer the question.
I'll finish with this.
Thank you.
He was involved in a number of other interactions, as you've outlined, that brought him to the same conclusion. It is quite possible that
he doesn't share the one that the guy he worked with.
Mr. Jordan, you may not like the witness's answer, but we will hear it.
There wasn't an answer.
Mr. Jordan, we will hear the witness's answer. Have you concluded, Mr. Holmes?
I have, sir.
I want to make sure the record is very clear. Ranking Member Nunes was correct. He correctly noted in his opening that Republicans, not Democrats on this committee, were the first ones to raise the issue of Russian interference in the 2016 election. The disagreement wasn't about Russian meddling. The disagreement was about whether or not President Trump conspired with Russia, a false allegation peddled by the Democrats generally and specifically by some Democrats on this committee. With that, Mr. Holmes, I want to turn to you and the part of the conversation, your testimony where you said you heard President Trump say, is he going to do the investigation? And Ambassador Sondland said he's going to do it. He'll do anything you ask him to. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What did President Trump say next?
He said, good, what about Sweden?
He said what?
Sir, sorry, I need to look at back where we are in the middle of the conversation here. Where are we from the testimony? Right, exactly. So then they turned to the Sweden conversation.
What did President Trump say next?
He said, good, what about Sweden?
Good, what about Sweden? Good, what about Sweden? Why isn't that in your statement?
Sir, it's not a word for word, every single word in the conversation.
But it's the most important part of the conversation.
Well, then they turned to Sweden. They turned to the other topic.
Respectfully, Mr. Holmes, this impeachment inquiry is based on the call the day before where President Trump, as part of a bribery scheme, as part of an extortion scheme, as part of a quid pro quo, according to the Democrats, demanded investigations in exchange for either military aid or a White House meeting. And the next day, you were witness to President Trump receiving word that the bribery scheme was successful, the extortion scheme was successful. And his response, was, good? What about Sweden?
Yes, sir. The Ukraine portion of that conversation was extremely brief.
What was the first thing the president said on the call? This was clear. You had a clear recollection of this conversation.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Radcliffe, please allow Mr. Holmes to answer.
Yes, sir. Sondland greeted the president.
How?
He said, He said, hello, Mr. President. I'm in Ukraine. I'm in Kyiv, and the president said, are you in Ukraine?
You think he said, I think you're in Ukraine? He said what?
He said, are you in Kyiv, Ukraine?
What did you hear President Trump say about ASAP Rocky?
I did not hear President Trump's side of the conversation about ASAP Rocky.
You said, how did we go from the conversation was very loud and his voice was recognizable to, as you say here, when the conversation shifted, I could only hear Ambassador Sondland's side of the conversation.
Yes, sir, as I've testified. The initial part of the call, Ambassador Sondland, sort of when the president came on the call, he sort of winced and held the phone away from his ear for the initial portion of the call. And then at some point in the call, he stopped doing that. And I don't know why. I don't know if he turned the volume down. I don't know if the president spoke more quietly. I don't know if he got used to the volume. I don't know what changed.
What did change? It's important. This was memorable.
I don't know, sir. It was Ambassador Sondland stopped moving the phone away from his ear. That's
what it was?
Yes.
Okay. How did the conversation end?
I only heard Ambassador Sondland's side of the conversation, sir. And at the end of the conversation, he was giving the president advice on how to deal with this ASAP Rocky situation. And he said, they should have released him on your word, and you can tell the Kardashians you tried.
Okay. So to be clear, when President Trump received word that President Zelensky had agreed to the investigations, he said, good. What about Sweden?
Yes.
Okay. When exactly did Gordon Sondland ask President Zelensky about the investigations?
I'm sorry, sir?
When did he ask about the investigations?
When did Gordon Sondland ask Zelensky about the investigations?
Yeah.
You guys, in which meeting did he raise the investigations?
Well, it was raised the day before on a call, and the next day, Gordon Sondland said the answer to that was he's going to do the investigation. So when did he ask about the investigation?
My assumption is he did it in the closed-door meeting with Yermak.
Well, I don't want to...
Time of the gentleman has expired.
I appreciate that, but I want to make sure the record's clear that yesterday Ambassador Sondland testified that the topic of conversations did not come up on that day. I yield
Time
back.
of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank both of our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to turn our discussion to the campaign to remove career diplomat Ambassador Yovanovitch. Both of you, in your various capacities, had to work with her.
We can't let this stand, and I don't think anyone here wants to let this stand. I actually don't believe that this is a partisan issue. I don't think anybody wants to come under personal attack.
Yeah, I unfortunately think that this has become the new norm, and we're being led by the very top of the food chain, which is our president, which is unfortunate. I'm especially disheartened by his treatment of women, and I think that the fact of the matter is that there's a long line of strong, talented women who have been smeared and victimized by this president, and we can either choose to ignore it or do something about it. And frankly, I think that whether you voted for him or whether you supported him or not, that doing so is wrong. You could simply just remove someone. You don't have to smear them. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Turner.
Right, I just want to echo that sentiment and certainly lament the attacks that have been levied against our colleague Lee Stefanik on this panel, which have been vile and hateful. For those of you keeping score at home, the effort to accuse our president of coercion, extortion, or bribery with these witnesses as we now come to the closing session of this basically break down as follows. We have Kent and Ambassador Taylor who spoke of hearsay. Their hearsay of these matters that they said that they had heard were all statements that they'd heard from others who have also testified in front of us. So there's no one that's missing. There's no one out there. Kent and Taylor basically said that they'd heard it from Morrison and Sondland. Morrison indicated he'd heard it from Sondland. Sondland testified yesterday he'd heard it from no one on the planet. Vindman and Morrison both have direct testimony of the phone call with the President of the United States. Beyond that, they only had contact with Sondland, and again, Sondland indicated he had contact with no one on the planet. Volker testified that he did have direct contact both with the Ukrainians and with the President of the United States, and indicated that the President of the United States did not condition either a phone call, a meeting, or aid upon Ukraine undertaking investigations, and also testified that the Ukrainians did not believe that either. We also have the direct statements from the President of Ukraine and the Foreign Minister that they did not feel any pressure to undertake investigations, and we also have the evidence that we're all very much aware of, which is they did not undertake any investigations. We also have Yovanovitch and Dr. Hill. Yovanovitch obviously left before the time period. Dr. Hill, we appreciate your being with us today, and Mr. Holmes. Dr. Hill, you have provided me probably the greatest piece of evidence that's before us to illustrate the problem with hearsay. So you said, based on questions and statements, I have heard some of you on this committee, that'd be us, appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country. And perhaps somehow, for some reason, it was Ukraine. So this is, it was held up by Devin Nunes, is the report on Russian active measures that was voted on by all of us. It begins with this sentence. In 2015, Russia began engaging in a covert influence campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Every one of us, a little small, effort on your part, Dr. Hill, and you would have known that what you just said was not true, what you had heard, but you felt the need to put it in your 8-page statement before you went on to tell us a bunch of other things that you heard about other people, no matter how convinced you were of, also which were not necessarily true. One of which was that you said that Ambassador Sondland met with Giuliani. Actually, Ambassador Sondland testified here that he had not, as ambassador, met with Giuliani. He'd briefly met him in his lifetime by shaking his hand. And Giuliani issued a statement that they had never met either. This is the problem with no matter how convinced we are, Dr. Hill, no matter how much we believe we know that what we've heard is true, it is still just what we've heard. But so far in this hearing, in these series of hearings, the only thing that we have is Volker saying, I spoke to the president and I've spoke to the Ukrainians, neither of which believed that aid was conditioned, neither of which believed that the president was requiring it, And Ambassador Sondland said no one on the planet told him that that was the case. That's the sole evidence. Now, I got to tell you, the one thing that's interesting is Ambassador Sondland did say it's his belief that a meeting with the president was conditioned upon investigations. Ambassador Volker, who I think is a man of very significant integrity, said that that was not the case. Now, even if Ambassador Sondland is correct, that somebody, and Dr. Hill, you testified, and again, it's hearsay, you don't know, that supposedly Mulvaney told him that, because he didn't testify to that. But let's say somebody beside the president told him that. You guys want to be the laughingstock of history to impeach a president of the United States because he didn't take a meeting? Oh, please, dear God. Please undertake that. Now, Mr. Holmes, I got to tell you, you
Sir,
say that you're there.
Is there a question for Dr. Hill?
Mr. Holmes, in your testimony, you said that Sondland said he loves your ass, and also said he'll do anything that you want. Mr. Holmes, that information had nothing whatsoever to do with the subject matter of any of these hearings. It was anecdotal, it was extraneous. Your statements that your interests are protecting Ukraine are very dubious when you embarrass President Zelensky by making those statements that you didn't have to make. Who cares that Ambassador Sondland said that? And you know you didn't embarrass Ambassador Sondland, you embarrassed Zelensky, because you know he got asked this question in his own country, and people are hearing that statement as if it's true.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
It's totally dubious of you to do that, for you to do that.
Mr. Carson, you are recognized.
I yield back.
Dr. Hill, you also testified, ma'am, that Ambassador Sondland was frequently meeting with Mr. Mulvaney. Mr. Giuliani's campaign of lies ultimately led to Ambassador Yovanovitch being recalled from her post in April 2019. You've also testified, ma'am, that her removal was pretty dispiriting and a turning point for you. Can you explain to us why, ma'am?
Well, again, as we've all made clear, Ambassador Yovanovitch, and you saw for yourselves in her deposition, is a person of great integrity. She's one of our finest foreign service officers, career foreign service officers. And if there'd been a decision to remove her, to replace her with a political appointee, again, that is perfectly within the rights of the president. Sometimes it's highly advisable, in fact, to emphasize to a country just exactly how close the relationship is likely to be, to have an appointee who is close to the president if it's an important relationship. But what was dispiriting was all of the accusations that were being fired at Ambassador Yovanovitch, leading her to be tweeted, including by members of the president's family. We all firmly believe that Mr. Giuliani and others, including the people who were recently indicted, the Ukrainian American gentleman, had for some reason decided that Ambassador Yovanovitch was some kind of personal problem for them, and that they had then decided to engage in just the kinds of things we've been discussing about. And frankly, she was an easy target as a woman. And I'm very sorry to hear about what's happened to Congressman Stefanik. And I think that this just illustrates the point and the problem that we're dealing with here today.
Certainly. I was also struck by your testimony that you were also the target of false accusations during your time in the Trump administration. You testified, ma'am, about receiving hateful calls and being accused of being, quote, a mole in the White House. You testified about death threats and calls at your home. Is that right?
That's correct. That was in 2017.
Well, I'm sorry you've had to go through all of this, ma'am. You don't strike me as a woman who is easily deterred. You're not easily deterred, are you, Dr. Hill?
I'm not, no.
Thank you both for your service. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Now recognize Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. You know, in 1998, I voluntarily joined the United States Army Reserve because I saw our country under attack time and time again. Bill Clinton was the president. I didn't vote for Bill Clinton, but he was my commander-in-chief. It didn't matter that I didn't vote for him. I'm grateful to live in a country that gets to legitimately elect our leaders. And I've been to places where people don't get to, and it's not pretty. And I respect our system, and I accept the results that are determined by the American people. I deployed to Iraq 2005, 2006 as an Army surgeon with soldiers from many backgrounds. The most important thing was we were all Americans. That was first and foremost. In our mission, we treated our troops, we treated the enemy, winning over the hearts and minds of people that never knew us because of their dictator, Saddam Hussein, who told them that we were responsible for all their problems, and that was his narrative. And speaking of narratives, Dr. Hill, I'm sorry, I have to say this. You said based on statements you've heard that some in this committee believe Russia did not conduct a campaign against our country is false. That's Mr. Schiff's narrative. That's where you've heard it. We did a whole report on it. And we agree that Russia has done this since the Soviet Union, and they've actually gotten better at it. That's a problem. But at the same time, certain Ukrainians did work against candidate Trump, some with the DNC. And if that's debunked, why is it Mr. Schiff has denied DNC operative Alexandra Chalupa from testifying to come forward and debunk it? I ask America, was it good for the country for the DNC and the Clinton campaign to pay Christopher Steele to dig up fake dirt with other foreign service sources on their political rival? Was it good for America to claim having evidence of the president colluding with Russians when he did not, costing the taxpayer millions and being debunked by special counsel? I'd say the false narrative got caught. Was it good for the country, for Americans and foreigners alike, to attempt to entrap members of a United States presidential campaign, specifically the Trump campaign? Sadly, I've come to believe through all this that some in power do think it's good. They think it's okay. And now we're here in an impeachment proceeding, certainly a right that Congress has, and apparently even with very partisan rules. But I'm curious, this impeachment inquiry was announced by the Speaker before the whistleblower complaint was even out. I'm curious why the lawyer for the whistleblower announced that the coup to impeach the president, that he announced that right after Trump won. That's pretty damning. I know it hurts after losing an election, especially as Americans, we usually get over it. And I imagine it would hurt even more if you were promised a position in the next administration and lost, and your hopes and your dreams are dashed. You know, I've seen hatred for political reasons, specifically on June 14th, 2017 at a ball field in Virginia. And I've seen hatred in war. And I know that hatred blinds people. I've been in war, and I've studied war. And coups create division. And it's time for this phase of the publicly announced and proclaimed Democrat coup to end. Thank you for your service. Thanks for being here, and I yield back.
Could I actually say something? Because we've had three.
Doctor, I was going to ask you if you'd like to respond. There have been a number. Gentleman suspended. Dr. Hill, you may respond.
No, I think that what Dr. Wenstrup said was very powerful about the importance of overcoming hatred and certainly partisan division. And it's unfortunate that Congressman Turner and Ratcliffe have both left as well. Because I think all of us who came here under a legal obligation also felt we had a moral obligation to do so. We came as fact witnesses. When I was referring to questions that I'd heard, it was in the context of the deposition that I gave on October 14th. Because I was very worried about the turn in which some of the questions were taking. And I understand that the point is being made about individuals, as you've just said, Dr. Wenstrup, and that these articles lay out taking different positions in our elections. I don't believe that there should be any interference of any kind in our election. I think it was unfair for people to already call the election and to make attacks also on candidate Trump and on President Trump. And I know that this has put a huge cloud over this presidency and also over our whole democratic system. That's actually why, as a non-partisan person and as an expert on Russia and an expert on Vladimir Putin and on the Russian security services, I wanted to come in to serve the country to try to see if I could help. I heard President Trump say that he wanted to improve the relations with Russia. I believe we have to. We can't be in this unending confrontation with Russia. We have to find a way to stabilize that relationship and to professionalize that relationship, as well as to stop them from doing what they did in 2016 again in 2020. This is really the crux of the issue. that I and others are trying to put across, and I think that you've put across very eloquently. The other matters related to this inquiry, we're here just to provide what we know and what we've heard. I understand that for many members this may be hearsay. I've talked about things I heard with my own ears. I understand that Ambassador Sondland has said a lot of things. I've told you what he told me and what others told me. A lot of other people have said things to me again as well, and also to Mr. Holmes, and we're here to relate to you what we heard, what we saw, and what we did, and to be of some help to all of you in really making a very momentous decision here. We are not the people who make that decision. And I do, again, want to underscore what you said here, Dr. Winstrup. It was very eloquent and very moving about your service and trying to bring us all together again as Americans. We need to be together again in 2020 so the American people can make a choice about the future and about make their vote in a presidential election without any fear that this is being interfered in from any quarter whatsoever. So I just want to thank you for making what I think was also a very elegant and eloquent and heartfelt defense.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Dr. Hill, Mr. Holmes, thank you both for being fact witnesses. We are here as fact finders, and we appreciate very much your presentations. Dr. Hill, I want to verify this story. I understand that when you were 11 years old, there was a schoolboy who set your pigtails on fire. And by President Trump calling Ukraine corrupt and not North Korea, for instance, does that accrue to Russia's benefit?
Again, doesn't help Ukraine.
All right. I thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the rest of my time to you.
You're yielding me 3 seconds. Not even I can make use of 3 seconds. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. Dr. Hill, Ms. Holmes, thank you for being here. I actually have no questions for you that haven't already been asked or made any points that haven't already been made. And I guess I'll just conclude by something I've said before. This Impeach-a-Palooza tour finally comes to an end. I mean, a year of resistance, 2.5 years of these absurd accusations against the president of Russian collusion. We've gone from quid pro quo to bribery to extortion, 7 weeks of hearings, 16 secret closed-door sessions, 12 public hearings now, of which you are the last, hundreds of hours of testimony. And I really think that for those who hate the president, they haven't changed their minds. But there's a lot of Americans who look at this and they think, is that it, really? You're going to impeach and remove a president for this? Now, like I said, if you don't like the president, you've already come to that conclusion. Many people wanted this 3 years ago. But for a lot of Americans, they really look at that, and they can see this. No evidence, zero evidence of any bribery, zero evidence of extortion, zero evidence firsthand of any quid pro quo. And yet, impeachment is almost inevitable. And why? Because the leadership of this committee has been unfair and dishonest. And I know we hear these crocodile tears from some of my colleagues who are heartbroken because they finally have to impeach this president. And we know that's absurd. There's no heartbroken. There's no prayerful tears over this. They're giddy over this. And there's not a person in the country who doesn't know that. Everyone knows what they're going to do next. They're going to impeach the president, and they're going to send it on to the Senate. But that is the good news. That's good news. You know, we've all been to a concert. You got the warm-up band, and then you got the main act. And what we've seen here is the warm-up band. This is kind of like the Sioux City Crooners. This is a band that no one's ever heard of. But the warm-up band is over, and now we're going to go on to the main event, and that's in the U.S. Senate. And in the U.S. Senate, there won't be any secret testimony. There's not going to be dishonest leadership or a chairman who refuses to let us ask appropriate questions or to deny a defense. Where in the world, where in the country do you have a trial where the prosecution presents their case and the defense isn't able to? So we'll finally be able to get to the truth. So I'm talking now to my colleagues in the Senate. These are some of the witnesses that you need to call, and these are some of the questions that you need to ask. First, you have to hear from the whistleblower. Now, they can choose to do that in closed session if they want to. I leave that up to them. But you can't initiate an impeachment of the President of the United States and not have to answer some questions. Who did he get his information from? Did he have the classification and the clearances to get that information? What's his relationship with Vice President Biden? Who has he shared that information with, including some members of the committee here? I think our own chairman needs to be called. What interactions did he or his staff have with the whistleblower? Did they help to coordinate or in any way facilitate the complaint? Did they coordinate and facilitate him counsel? What about Hunter Biden? How did he get his job? What did he do to earn his salary? And here's the key to this. Look, if he goes there and makes money, knock yourself out. I don't care. But I want to know, did he have officials with, or conversations with government officials, and was government policy changed at a particularly high level because of some of those? Devin Archer, former board member from Burisma. Alexandria Chalupa, former DNC official who admitted she provided anti-Trump information to the DNC and to Hillary Clinton. Nellie Orr from Fusion GPS, who helped to create the ridiculous Steele dossier. I'd like to remind us what I said yesterday. The American people expect a lot in politics. They understand the tussle, the fight, the debate, but they also expect basic fairness. And these proceedings have been anything but fair. The Senate has an opportunity to fix that. I am confident they will, and I look forward to them completing the job that we could have done here. And with that, I will yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Before I turn to our witnesses, I just wanted to say to my Democratic colleagues, not a single Republican member of this committee has said that Russia did not meddle in the 2016 elections. As the ranking member stated, we published a report focused on Russian active measures in 2016 with policy recommendations as to how we strengthen our cyber resiliency and election security to counter Russia. I myself have worked with members of this very committee on this issue, but also on the House Armed Services Committee. So to have our Democratic colleagues say these untruthful statements just reeks of political desperation in their continued obsession to manipulate mainstream media coverage. But the good news is the American people understand that this has been a partisan process from the start. The Democratic coordination with the whistleblower, the incessant and astounding leaks, the unprecedented closed-door process, closed to the majority of members, closed to the press, closed to the people, starting this inquiry without taking a vote. And then when finally forced to take a vote, the vote was with bipartisan opposition. Now, with 4 minutes left, I'm going to turn to our two witnesses. Thank you both for your service. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for your comments on the personal attacks. I wanted to ask you each fact-based questions. Dr. Hill, you testified that you handed over your duties on the NSC to Tim Morrison on July 15th and that you physically left the White House on July 19th, correct?
That is correct, yes.
So that means that by the time there was the July 25th call with President Trump and President Zelensky, you were no longer on the NSC, correct?
Actually, I was still technically on the payroll of the NSC until the end of August 30th of 2019. But I was not physically in the building, and I'd handed over my duties to Mr. Morrison.
And you were not on the call?
I was not on the call. That is absolutely correct.
And it's also correct that you did not participate in the preparation of talking points or the specific coordination of setting up the call?
Not for that call, but let me just say for the record that there had been a long anticipation that eventually there would be a call. So there was a call package that was prepared in advance. I just cannot say how much of that call package that had perhaps been prepared since, for example, the inauguration of President Zelensky was then used as the basic material for that call. So I did take part in the preparation of that standard call package, but I did not take part in any preparation for the specific call on July 25th.
And the first time you actually read the transcript of the call was when it was released to the public?
That's correct.
Mr. Holmes, I wanted to turn to you. Good to see you again. Thank you for mentioning the bipartisan delegation that I led on behalf of the House Armed Services Committee with my friend, Representative Anthony Brown from Maryland. We did have an exceptionally informative visit where we highlighted the bipartisan congressional support for Ukraine, in particular the importance of countering Russian aggression. And we discussed in the briefings at the embassy the importance of defensive lethal aid in the form of javelins javelins, which, as you both, I think you stated today, is, quote, an important strategic deterrent to Russia. And I just want to highlight on the record, I know this has been asked, the javelins were provided by the Trump administration and not the Obama administration, correct?
That's correct. And I would just say, I think we discussed the importance of all our security assistance to Ukraine, not just the javelins.
Absolutely, all of our security assistance, which I strongly support. Again, thank you for being a host on that. Dr. Hill, turning back to you, there's been discussion about the process of scheduling the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump. And you testified that there was hesitancy to schedule this meeting until after the Ukrainian parliamentary elections. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And that's because there was speculation in all analytical circles, both in Ukraine and outside the Ukraine, that Zelensky might not be able to get the majority that he needed to form a cabinet, correct?
That is correct.
And you also testified that another aspect of the NSC's hesitancy to schedule this meeting was based on broader concerns related to Zelensky's ability to implement anti-corruption reforms. And this was in specific relation to Ukrainian oligarchs who basically were the owner of the TV company that Mr. Zelensky's program had been a part of. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You know, just distilling this down to the key facts, I wanted to ask both of you three key questions. So the fact of the matter is Ukraine ultimately did receive the aid, correct, Mr. Holmes?
Ultimately.
Yes. And Dr. Hill?
Correct, ultimately.
And there was no investigation into the Bidens, correct, Mr. Holmes?
They did not open a new investigation into the Bidens. No.
Correct. And Dr. Hill?
Correct.
And there was, in fact, a meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky ultimately at the UN. Is that correct?
The president invited Zelensky to the Oval Office at a date undetermined. That has not yet happened.
The meeting at the UN. President Trump and President Zelensky met at the UN.
They did, but not in the Oval Office.
But they did have a meeting at the UN.
They did, ma'am.
And Dr. Hill, they did? Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Swalwell.
Dr. Hill, yesterday I think a lot of Americans were scratching their heads as Ambassador Sondland testified that on September 9 he calls the President of the United States and just says broadly, "What do you want from Ukraine?" And the President says, "There's no quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo." It's like being pulled over for speeding and being asked, "Do you know how fast you're going?" and saying, "I didn't rob the bank. I didn't rob the bank."
Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Mr. Holmes, for your years of service to this country, and I appreciate y'all being here today. Throughout this process, I have said that I want to learn the facts so we can get to the truth. So why are we here? Because of two things that occurred during the President's July 25th phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. The use of the phrase, "do us a favor," though, in reference to the 2016 presidential election, and the mention of the word Biden. I believe both statements were inappropriate, misguided foreign policy, and it's certainly not how the executive, current or in the future, should handle such a call. Over the course of these hearings, the American people have learned about a series of events that, in my view, have undermined our national security and undercut Ukraine, a key partner on the front lines against Russian aggression. We've heard of U.S. officials carrying uncoordinated, confusing, and conflicting messages that created doubt and uncertainty in Kyiv at a time when a new reformist administration has just taken office and was ready to fight corruption and work with us to advance other U.S. objectives. I disagree with this sort of bungling foreign policy. But through these hearings, many of my colleagues have unwittingly undermined the Ukrainian government by suggesting that it is subservient to the United States, and without the United States, they wouldn't be able to function. The Ukrainians, as you stated, Mr. Holmes, is in a hot war with Russia, and they are holding their own. We could benefit from the experience of the Ukrainians, not the other way around. While I thought the Intelligence Committee would actually be engaged in oversight of the intelligence and national security communities, unfortunately, we are not. We're here talking about one of the most serious constitutional duties we have as members of Congress, the impeachment and removal of the President of the United States. Over the past weeks, we've learned a few things. The officials on the July 25th call have many different opinions on whether the call was concerning or not, and just because Vice President Biden is running for president does not mean that corruption related to Burisma, Ukraine's largest natural gas company, and Americans' ties to it are not concerning. There's also a lot we do not know. We We've not heard from Rudy Giuliani. We haven't heard from Hunter Biden. I'd like to know more about both of their activities, why they talk to whom and to whom. Despite promises from Chairman Schiff, we have also not heard from the whistleblower, something that can occur in a closed setting without violating his or her anonymity. We need to understand the motivations and level of coordination that happened prior to his or her submission of the complaint. Over the past few weeks, and even today, it's been reiterated. In 2017, the Trump administration made the decision to provide lethal defensive aid to Ukraine after the Obama administration refused to do so. Ukraine is receiving all the security assistance as directed by Congress. President Zelensky has undertaken significant anti-corruption efforts, including eliminating the parliamentary immunity from prosecution. And, again, Mr. Holmes, you mentioned this today, under President Zelensky's leadership, we have finally seen some progress this fall towards ending the Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. So where does this leave us? An impeachable offense should be compelling, overwhelmingly clear, and unambiguous, and it's not something to be rushed or taken lightly. I've not heard evidence proving the president committed bribery or extortion. I also reject the notion that holding this view means supporting all the foreign policy choices we have been hearing about over these last few weeks. To paraphrase Tim Morrison's testimony this week, every day the national conversation on Ukraine is focused on impeachment, not the conflict in the Donbass, not the illegal occupation of Crimea, not the need for reforms in Ukraine's government economy. It's a day where we are not focused on our shared national security interests with Kyiv. I hope that we won't let this very partisan process keep us from agreeing on how a free and prosperous Ukraine is important to the security of the Ukrainian people, the United States of America, and the rest of the world. Mr. Chairman, before I yield back my time, I'd like to make a statement for the record that has this committee been given proper notice as required by House Rule 11, Clause 2G3, that a business meeting was to follow last night's hearing, and had Mr. Conaway's point of order been appropriately recognized, I would have voted no on the committee's first motion to table during last night's impromptu meeting, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Castro.
If the Congress allows a president of the United States, now or later, to ask a foreign government, head of state, to investigate a political rival, what precedent does that set for American diplomacy, for the safety of Americans overseas, and for the future of our country?
It's a very bad precedent.
Very bad precedent, and going forward, if that were ever the case, I would raise objections.
Thank you both. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Radcliffe.
Thank you, Chair. I want to return the favor and recognize my colleague, yield to my colleague, Congressman Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hill, I don't think there's a lot of questions that one of Putin's primary objectives within the United States is to foment unrest within our nation, to cause us to have lose confidence in our elections, the results of the elections, those kind of things. There is tension, though, in conducting our businesses the way we should, and playing into Putin's hands. As an example, while I disagree with what we're doing here today, it's under our Constitution, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that they are functioning under that Constitution. These hearings, this issue is very divisive within our country, and is continuing to push that way. I think that plays into Putin's hands inadvertently. Maybe nothing we can do about that. But there are certain things we can do as individuals that wouldn't play into his hands, and one of them would be that the loser in the 2016 election has for 3 years continued to argue that because she won the popular vote, and she and her friends won the popular vote, that somehow the election was inappropriate and that we shouldn't trust it, that the Electoral College victory, which was resounding, shouldn't be trusted. Does that help Putin or play into the narrative that he would like for us to do, that our elections are somehow rigged and shouldn't be trusted?
Yes, it does.
So the RT, Putin's, would you agree with me that RT is Putin's propaganda machine here in the United States?
I would agree with you, yes.
So is it appropriate for the RT to be used to affect public policy on our nation? As an example, there have been a long series of advertisements or programs on RT going against fracking, saying that's bad and trying to affect public policy in the United States. Is that appropriate use, or should Americans be paying attention to that?
In the sense that Americans should be paying attention that RT and other outlets are used to propagate this kind of information, absolutely. I wasn't quite sure what you meant about should
just
be paying attention.
Fracking is a controversial issue within our nation. If we did away with fracking, the United States would not be in a position today to dominate the oil production within the world and would play into strengthening Putin's hands with respect to the oil.
That's correct. And actually, I'd like to point out that in 2011, in November 2011, I actually sat next to Vladimir Putin at a conference in which he made precisely that point. It was the first time that he had actually done so to a group of American journalists and experts who were brought to something called the Valdai Discussion Club. So he started in 2011 making it very clear that he saw American fracking as a great threat to Russian interests. We were all struck by how much he stressed this issue, and it's since 2011 and since that particular juncture that Putin has made a big deal of this.
So the extent that Americans pay attention to RT and are misguided by whatever propaganda he's going, it's not in our nation's best interest. Mr. Holmes, in your role, you're privileged to an awful lot of stuff, official things and things that are best kept between you and the official folks that you deal with. Is there an expectation among the principles that you represent that you will exercise some discretion in what you share with others about what goes on?
Yes, sir.
In your testimony, in your deposition, you made the well. First off, we had a hard time pinning down the number of people that you've actually had this conversation with about the conversation that you overheard. Now, our ambassador had no expectation of privacy. He's blustering around and doing what he's done, but we couldn't figure out how many people you actually shared that information with. And I would argue that the information is unflattering to the president, unflattering to the ambassador, and that your discretion is at odds here. I mean, your testimony, your deposition said you shared that with folks who you thought would find it interesting. Well, I'd argue that everybody on the back row would find it interesting, but I don't know that that's necessarily a criterion. So on a go-forward basis, can you articulate that in the future, when you're privileged to certain circumstances that would be embarrassing to the principal, that if it's official that you share with the ambassador, that's fine, but the folks outside the embassy or folks even within the embassy that don't have a need to know, that you wouldn't regale them with your recounting of those instances?
Sir, I think it was Gordon Sondland who showed indiscretion by having that conversation over.
No, well,
that's the first thing. Second thing is,
excuse me,
Mr.
Holmes. Let me clarify the question.
Mr. Holmes,
the question wasn't. Excuse me, Mr.
Let him answer your question, sir.
It's my question. You're exactly right, and I get to clarify my question to get the answer. And I'm hopeful I get in a few more seconds because of the interruption from the chairman. His patience is growing thin. I was working hard not to irritate him again, but I failed again. The question is of you, Mr. Holmes. Your discretion. Gordon Sondland did not expect privacy. I got that. But you're going to be in rooms you've been in rooms 17 years where people trust that when whatever went on in that room and left, that you kept it to official channels, that you didn't share all that information with other folks. And I'm just asking you to argue on your own behalf that interesting is not some sort of a criterion that you would use when you share information from meetings. Simple, straightforward question.
Sir, I shared the information that I needed to share with the right people who needed to know it. I did not share any information that people didn't need to know.
But you did use the word interesting,
Mr. Conaway, your time is expired.
It certainly was interesting, sir. And I would also hate to think that what I brought before this process, I shouldn't have done that. I've come here because you've subpoenaed me to share what I know, and I've done that.
Mr. Holmes, you were cut off when you were talking about Mr. Sondland's indiscretion. Did you want to finish that answer?
I think...
Mr. Chairman, that's patently unfair.
Mr. Conaway,
as you've run this entire investigation.
It's unfair, Mr. Conaway, to interrupt the witnesses as you have done repeatedly.
Well, but you're certainly willing to interrupt me during my 5 minutes. You're the only person on this dais that has unlimited time. You have absolutely unlimited time. You're the only one that has abused that power, and you're continuing to do that.
Conaway, the gentleman will cease. We allow the witnesses to answer the question, even if those asking the question don't want to hear the answer. Mr. Heck, you are right.
Does that apply to you as well?
Mr. Holmes, we all just came from the floor, and it's a majestic chamber, and in the front of the chamber there are only 2 portraits. On the left, looking forward, is my favorite president, George Washington, and on the right is the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to this country to help us stand up our fledgling democracy. So here's another big truth. Without his help, we probably never would have gotten off the ground. And that assistance from many other countries who are helping us to create something that had never been created before. It was an audacious idea, this notion of a democracy, of self-governance, of freedoms such as speech and press and religion and expression and assembly, and most of all, that it would be rooted in the premise of the rule of law. Not monarchs, not military strongmen, but the rule of law. Others helped us to get here, and we wouldn't be here without them. And I frankly feel like we're almost in a little bit of a pay it forward moment. So when the president did it, he put at risk the security of Ukraine, a strategic ally and a nascent democracy with their masses yearning to breathe free, who 6 years ago this day, when their government said we're not going to sign that memorandum of agreement with the European Union, rose up and took to the streets because they wanted, frankly, what we have. And when the president did it, he put our own national security at risk. But what he did, most importantly, was put at risk that idea that makes us exceptional. Because I do believe America is truly exceptional. We are a country rooted in something that nobody has ever tried before, rule of law. He put that at risk when he did what he did. The president did it. And the only question that remains is, what will we do? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Hill, during your deposition, I asked you, was Christopher Steele's dossier a rabbit hole? Do you remember the answer you gave to that
Yes,
question?
I thought it was a rabbit hole.
Yeah, and you also said a couple pages later in the deposition, or in the transcript that I have here of your deposition, that you thought he got played. Is that fair?
That is fair, yes.
I was struck by a number of things you said in your statement, a number of things I thought were right on the target, and one was on page 7. You said this: President Putin and the Russian security services weaponize our own political opposition research. And that is exactly what happened in 2016. Exactly what happened. You called it, you knew it, you saw it. The DNC hired Perkins Coie, who hired Fusion GPS, who hired Christopher Steele, who talked to Russians, who gave him a bunch of dirt, bunch of National Enquirer garbage that he compiled in a dossier, and our FBI used it. They used it as part of their investigation that they opened in July of 2016, where they spied on 2 American citizens associated with the presidential campaign. My guess is that's probably never happened in American history, and exactly what Dr. Hill talked about is what happened in 2016. Exactly what she talked about. And for 10 months, Jim Comey and his team did an investigation. And after 10 months, they had nothing, because we deposed Mr. Comey. And he told us, after 10 months, we didn't have a thing. But that didn't matter. That didn't matter. We got the Mueller investigation. $32 million, 19 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, 500 search warrants, 2,800 subpoenas. And they came back this spring, and what'd they tell us? No collusion, no conspiracy, no coordination. But the guys on the other side don't care. They don't care. They're doing what Dr. Hill said a number of important things in her opening statement. They're doing exactly what Dr. Hill talked about. The impact of a successful 2016 Russian campaign remains evident today. Our nation is being torn apart. Torn apart. I've never seen it this divided. And it is not healthy. It is not healthy for our culture, our country, not healthy for our nation, but that's what these guys are doing. No conspiracy, no coordination, no collusion, but they don't care. Now this whole impeachment thing, as the witness said yesterday, without an announcement from Zelensky about an investigation, they weren't going to get a call with the president, they weren't going to get a meeting with the president, they weren't going to get aid from the United States. But guess what? Ukraine, they got the call, they got the meeting, and they got the money, and there was never an announcement of any type of investigation. This is, but they don't care. They're going to move forward. There's going to be some kind of report. They're going to send some, I assume, something to the Judiciary Committee, and the process is going to go forward, and there'll be a trial in the Senate, all based on some anonymous whistleblower who came forward with no firsthand knowledge, who's biased against the president, who worked with Joe Biden. Now all this. Now all this. This is, Dr. Hill's right. She said it. We got to stop this. But they're not going to. And they're doing it all 11 and a half months before the next election. And I think maybe the most telling thing is what the Speaker of the House said Sunday. Speaker of the House said Sunday. This is scary. Speaker of the House said Sunday. National Sunday morning TV show. She said the president is an imposter. The guy that 63 million people voted for, who won an electoral college landslide, the Speaker of the House of Representatives called the President of the United States an imposter. Sad. It is sad what the country's going through. I wish it would stop, but unfortunately I don't think it is. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Welch.
You know, I asked some of our witnesses what would happen in any American city or town if the mayor stopped funding the police department until the chief of police launched an investigation into the mayor's political rival, or a governor or a member of Congress did that. And the answer was clear. It would be wrong, it would be illegal, and it wouldn't be tolerated. It would violate the most basic trust we have in public officials. If it happened with a military commander, a court-martial would follow. If it happened with a corporation, a CEO would be fired. We all know this kind of conduct is wrong, but the president continues to say it isn't. He says it's perfect, and he'd do it again tomorrow. The same rules apply to mayors, governors, members of Congress, CEOs, and everyone else in America. They apply to the president too. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you like MSNBC or Fox, I think every American believes in one of our nation's founding principles. No person is above the law, not even the president.
You said in your deposition, specifically, a conspiracy was launched against you by convicted felon Roger Stone on the show InfoWars, led by Alex Jones, right?
I don't think he was a convicted felon at the time that he launched this, so I didn't use those exact words. But it was indeed Roger Stone and Alex Jones on InfoWars in 2017. And in fact, just more recently, before Mr. Stone endured his trial, they were at it again, reprising the same InfoWars video and adding embellishments.
And they said, I'll quote what they said about you. We here at InfoWars, this is Roger Stone speaking, first identified Fiona Hill, the globalist leftist George Soros insider who had infiltrated McMaster's staff. He said that on May 31st, 2017. I presume you're not a globalist leftist Soros insider, correct?
I think my coal mining family would be very surprised to hear all of these things about me.
I'd agree.
Actually, leftist, perhaps not so much, but you know, anyway, the left in Europe is a bit different from the left here, let's put it that way.
I agree. Interestingly, you stated in your deposition that a similar conspiracy theory had actually been launched against Marie Yovanovitch.
That's correct.
And you said specifically, when I saw this happening to Ambassador Yovanovitch, again, I was furious because this is, again, just this whipping up of what is frankly an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about George Soros to basically target nonpartisan career officials. Isn't that what you said?
I did say that, yes.
And I'm sure you've been watching with concern what's happened to other nonpartisan career officials. We had Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, an American immigrant, questioned for his criticism of the president in a very unfair way, you know, basically questioning his loyalty to the country. I believe that he's also of Ukrainian Jewish descent. Would you say that these different theories, these conspiracy theories that have been targeting you, spun in part by folks like Mr. Stone, as well as fueled by Rudy Giuliani and others, basically have a tinge of anti-Semitism to them at least?
Well, certainly when they involve George Soros, they do. I'd just like to point out that in the early 1900s, the Tsarist secret police produced something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which actually you can still obtain on the internet, and you can buy it actually sometimes in bookshops in Russia and elsewhere. This is the longest running anti-Semitic trope that we have in history. And the trope against Mr. Soros, George Soros, was also created for political purposes. And this is the new Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I'd actually intended to write something about this before I was actually invited to come into the administration because it's an absolute outrage.
I'm sorry you've been kind of wrapped up in these crackpot conspiracy theories.
Now go to closing statements. Mr. Nunes, do you have any closing remarks?
Thank you. I have stressed in these hearings that the whistleblower complaint was merely a pretext for Donald Trump's political opponents to do what they've been trying to do since he was elected, oust the president from office. A brief timeline will illustrate the wide range of extraordinary attacks his administration has faced. I'm going to start in June of 2016 when Donald Trump was just a candidate. On behalf of the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign, Fusion GPS hires Christopher Steele to write the Steele dossiers, a collection of false allegations attributed to Russian sources claiming that Donald Trump is a Russian agent. Fast forward to January 6th of 2017. FBI Director James Comey briefs President-elect Trump on the Steele dossier. The briefing is leaked to CNN, and soon afterwards, BuzzFeed publishes the dossiers. January 20th, on President Trump's inauguration day, the Washington Post runs a story headlined, quote, "The campaign to impeach Donald Trump has begun." January 30th, 10 days later, the whistleblower's current lawyer tweets, hashtag coup has started, first of many steps, hashtag rebellion, hashtag impeachment will follow immediately. March 22nd, Democrats on this committee falsely declare on national TV that they have more than circumstantial evidence that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. July 12th, an article of impeachment is filed against President Trump in the House of Representatives. November 15th, Democrats file additional articles of impeachment against President Trump. As you see, this was just in President Trump's first year in office. He was subjected to a coordinated smear operation designed to falsely portray him as a Russian agent, as well as attempts to impeach him. This all occurred before his now infamous call with President Zelensky. In 2018, the attacks continued, often from executive branch officials charged with implementing his policies. On February 2nd, 2018, Intelligence Committee Republicans release a memo revealing that the FBI used fabrications of the Steele dossier to get a warrant to spy on a Trump campaign associate. September 5th, the New York Times prints a column by an anonymous Trump administration official who explains that he and other senior officials are, quote, working diligently from within to frustrate parts of Trump's agenda, unquote. December 7th, James Comey admits to Congress the Steele dossier was unverified before and after the FBI used it to get a warrant to spy on a Trump campaign associate. The Russia hoax continued to be the main focus of attacks going into 2019, but when that entire operation collapsed, a new impeachment pretext had to be found. May 4th, 2019, on national television, a Democratic congressman proclaims, quote, "I'm concerned that if we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected," unquote. July 24th of this year, Special Counsel Robert Mueller testifies to Congress about his report, which debunked the conspiracy theory that the Trump campaign associates conspired with Russia to hack the 2016 elections. July 25th, just the very next day, a new anti-Trump operation begins as someone listens to the president's phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky and leaks the contents to the so-called whistleblower. September 13th, Democrats on this committee take the extraordinary step of issuing a press release related to the whistleblower's complaint. October 2nd, it's revealed that Democratic staff on this committee had contact with the whistleblower before he submitted his complaint to the Inspector General, contradicting Democrat denials that such contact had occurred. October 31st, Halloween, probably the most appropriate day. Democrats in the House of Representatives vote to open an official impeachment inquiry against President Trump. What you've seen in this room over the past 2 weeks is a show trial. The planned result of 3 years of political operations and dirty tricks. Campaigns waged against this president. And like any good show trial, the verdict was decided before the trial ever began. After all, after denouncing the president for years as a Russian agent and a threat to democracy, how could the Democrats not impeach him? If they don't move to overthrow him, it would indicate that they don't really believe their own dire warnings about the threat he poses. The Democrats only needed a pretext. When their Russian dossiers and investigations failed to do the job, they moved to Plan B, the Ukraine hoax. This spectacle, with its secret depositions and mid-hearing press conferences, is not meant to discover the facts. It was designed to produce a specific storyline to be pushed forward by the Democrats and their supporters in the media. Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach Thanksgiving, Speaker Pelosi has just made clear, just today, USMCA, free trade deal with Canada and Mexico, that will boost our economy, won't be signed this year. So I hope Mr. Schiff will clarify how much longer we will waste on this effort and what other vital legislation he's willing to sacrifice for this impeachment crusade. Will there be even more secret depositions accompanied by the usual flood of Democratic leaks? Will we have more public hearings with Democrat witnesses but not ours? Minority are in the dark about what this committee will be doing when we return. And so is America. James Madison warned us about the danger posed by the tyranny of the majority. To avoid that threat, our founders created a constitutional republic. But is there a better example of the tyranny of majority than the way this impeachment process has been run in the House of Representatives? A process that is grossly unfair can only stem from a cynical majority that is willing to break long-established precedents, trample on legitimate minority concerns, and impose their absolute will on this body through sheer force of numbers. Exploiting the Intelligence Committee as a venue for impeachment has been one of the grossest abuses in a process filled with cynical manipulations, large and small. But this farce will soon move to the Judiciary Committee, where impeachment rightfully belongs. I wish my Republican colleagues well in fighting this travesty and defending the idea, which at one time received bipartisan support not long ago. But the American people's vote actually means something. Yield back.
You're not Democratic witnesses or Republican witnesses. You're nonpartisan witnesses, and you have stuck to the facts, and that is as it should be. Anyone watching these proceedings, anyone reading the deposition transcripts would have the same impression that you evidently had from hearing my colleagues talk about the Russia hoax, that the whole idea that Russia had gotten involved in the 2016 election was a hoax put out by the Democrats. And of course, they're not alone in pushing out this idea. It is trumpeted by no one other than the President of the United States, who almost on a daily basis at times would comment and tweet and propagate the idea that Russia's interference in our election was a hoax. And of course, we all remember that debacle in Helsinki when the president stood next to Vladimir Putin and questioned his own intelligence agencies. I wish I had heard just some of the righteous indignation we heard in the committee today when the president questioned that fundamental conclusion of our intelligence agencies, but of course they were silent. Well, I guess that's case closed, right? No quid pro quo. What do you want from Ukraine? No quid pro quo. That says to me this president believes he is above the law. And in my view, there is nothing more dangerous than an unethical president who believes they are above the law. And I would just say to people watching here at home and around the world, in the words of my great colleague, we are better than that. Adjourned.